There we go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final session for today of Calc. And I will just hand you straight over to Angela. Thank you, Angela.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Angela Pasha. I was an academic librarian in the US for 12 years before becoming a leadership development coach. As a librarian, I focused a lot on developing critical pedagogy skills and teaching critical information literacy. I attended Lottie Needham's talk yesterday on leveraging criticality among academic library leaders, and Lottie reaffirmed my perception of the critical librarianship space as focusing predominantly on critical information literacy, critical pedagogy, and critical collections, with very little attention paid to critical management studies. I think that's starting to change a little bit, but it takes time to build. That representation matters, and not seeing people in leadership positions talking openly about trying to use a more critical approach with their teams affected my career trajectory. For the majority of my library career, I genuinely did not want to move into a leadership position because I held all of the values that led me to embrace critical pedagogy, and those values felt at odds with a lot of the narratives I knew about becoming a boss. I eventually became a reluctant leader and had to figure out how to lead effectively without sacrificing my values. I'm obviously biased here, but I believe that having a solid grounding in critical librarianship makes for better leaders. When we're willing to question why things are the way they are and what unexamined assumptions went into those decisions, then we can build more equitable and inclusive spaces for our users and for our teams. And when we're willing to listen to our team members' expertise and share power in the way we approach important decisions, then we can do a better job of helping our team members develop in ways that are meaningful to them. So today, I'm going to talk with you about some of the narratives that made me reluctant to move into a leadership role and that regularly come up with the library leaders that I coach. And then one specific practice that provides a practical way to translate like the theoretical critical approach into action with your team. Ooh, there we go. So the first line here is, I don't want to tell people what to do. This one was a huge block for me. And I regularly hear others with this perception that being in a leadership role is all about telling people what to do. And the job does include some responsibilities that make this power dynamic feel real, like setting clear expectations, holding people accountable, and communicating demands from above. Framing those responsibilities as telling people what to do leaves a lot of the leaders I work with feeling like their work is in conflict with their values. Whether you call it a collaborative approach or a critical commitment to sharing power, they want to work with people instead of holding power over people. But there are ways to share some of that power and give your team members some degree of autonomy. How much, of course, depends on their job descriptions. So librarians tend to have more autonomy baked into their roles than those who are hired to spend most of their shift at a public service desk. But even when the job description doesn't leave a whole lot of room for flexibility in day-to-day tasks, sharing power can mean actively listening and involving people in the process of making decisions about the policies that'll directly affect their work. We need more people in leadership who want to look for as many of those opportunities as possible to share power. Leaders are supposed to have an answer for everything. So that's another common narrative that I hear. And it's one that's really good at feeding imposter syndrome gremlins because none of us knows everything. But when you're carrying that pressure around, that's a lot to live up to. But when we think about a critical approach and wanting to honor other people's expertise and empower our team members, we have to kind of take a little bit of a reframe here. So when you walk around feeling responsible for having an answer for everything, how are you honoring the expertise that your team members bring to the equation? When you feel responsible for solving every problem, how do you help your team members develop the skills and confidence to solve those problems themselves so they can take more ownership of their work? As employees, many of us find it frustrating when our leaders make decisions without asking for our input or doing the, performative give me feedback that I'm not going to listen to thing. It's far more empowering to have some shared governance structures and a manager who asks us to share our expertise and really listens. But then when we step into leadership, it can feel like we're not allowed to ask those questions or admit to not already knowing everything. One of the many things that I love about coaching as a leadership style is that it's an established approach that explicitly gives you permission to ask questions and provides a framework for using inquiry to help your team members develop as professionals. Focusing on a work context, we don't generally get to talk about helping employees develop a critical consciousness or liberatory education the way we might in a critical pedagogy discussion. The closest we can usually get is helping them shape their work in a way that's meaningful to them and giving them a meaningful voice and making the decisions that are most relevant to their work. And coaching is a powerful way to accomplish those goals. Leaders aren't supposed to show weakness or doubt or make any mistakes. Brene Brown has been influential in promoting a more authentic style of leadership, but her work is important because of how pervasive this narrative is. From a critical perspective, the story also hides our full humanity. As Bell Hooks discussed in the context of engaged pedagogy, teaching with care and empathy toward liberation can take an emotional toll. And that applies to leaders using a critical approach and trying to share power as well. We need to put time and energy toward our own self-actualization in order to continue showing up the way that we want to show up. When we don't prioritize this work, it's really easy to wind up reacting instead of responding thoughtfully. So those knee-jerk reactions can be anything from just solving the problem out of habit when you really would rather coach them through solving the problem themselves, to behaviors that can damage team morale. And spending too long just reacting without taking time to take care of yourself leads to burning out. Taking care of your own well-being and carving out time for reflective practice are important parts of maintaining your coaching mindset as well. Another common narrative is the idea that anyone can be just a natural leader, as though leadership were some inherent trait instead of a skill that has to be learned and practiced. So this is problematic on one level because it supports a more fixed mindset instead of a learning mindset. If it's something that you just have or don't, then every little difficulty feeds the imposter syndrome gremlins. Maybe it's a sign that you don't really belong here, instead of just a sign that you need to build some new skills. But then on a more structural level, this sets up a rigid hierarchy of haves and have-nots. The natural leaders who deserve to be promoted, and the rest of us who deserve to just be worker bees. As bad as that sounds, it becomes even more problematic when you start to explore the ways that privilege and structural oppression shape this discussion. Race, gender, class, ability, and many other factors play a role in how the exact same behaviors are perceived. We see this in studies that show reviews of the exact same behaviors described as assertive when men do it and aggressive when women do it. We see this in the ways someone's accent can shape the ways that their words are perceived, and on and on. Beyond just the ways that actions are perceived, We also don't all have equal access to opportunities to learn leadership skills in lower stakes contexts throughout our lives. Those seemingly natural leaders had access, support, and resources to learn those skills, and parents who recognized the value of nurturing those skills. Anthropological studies of differences between working class and middle class parents have shown that those class divisions are maintained in part by the way parents reinforce or discourage different behaviors. So there's nothing natural or innate about being a great leader. It's a skill that you have to learn and actively practice. And then the last narrative was anyone who wants to be in charge probably shouldn't be in charge. I don't hear this one as much from others, but it's one that made me incredibly reluctant to accept a formal leadership role. And I came to it by watching the ways some really toxic leaders clung to power, becoming more toxic as they resisted any suggestion that they have room for improvement. And honestly, when I modify this one to focus on anyone who wants to be the type of leader described in these narratives, then I still kind of agree that they probably shouldn't be trusted to lead a team. But we need more people who want the power to challenge these narratives about leadership and reshape what it means to lead a team. That means bringing a critical approach to your leadership style. That means building the skills to empower your team members and share power in the decision-making processes. As I mentioned, I resisted moving into a leadership role until I eventually became a reluctant leader. I didn't want to become a manager, but I accepted it as a harm reduction strategy. And even though I'm talking about like my personal experience, this is an established term. It's something that is a pretty common experience of people moving into leadership when they don't really want to take that role on for any number of reasons, including a lot of these narratives. Being new to leadership, I was fortunate that I had support available to enroll in leadership development training. But as I explored my options, I struggled to find anything library focused that felt consistent with my values. So I started looking beyond library land and wound up learning about coaching. So I used the definition from the International Coaching Federation, the largest member-led professional organization for professional coaches. And when you see articles about the great benefits from developing a coaching culture in your organization, they're generally using a definition more like this one. So the ICF version of coaching is a strengths-based technique that uses structured and intentional inquiry to help someone work through some challenge. In this technique, the coach does very little talking, generally less than 20% of the conversation. The assumption is that the person being coached is fully capable of working through the challenge and just needs someone to help them break out of either, thought patterns that have been keeping them stuck in like one single rut, or detangle a mess of swirling thoughts, or work through some decision paralysis or whatever. This is a valuable approach to use whenever you can give your team members some degree of autonomy, whether that's something as small as how to structure regular check-ins on a performance improvement plan, or something as big as deciding on a research agenda. So the ICF defines coaching as partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. So let's break that down a little bit. Partnering is about the power dynamics within that conversation. In professional coaching, the ideal is that the coach is there as an equal partner with the person that we're coaching. So that's one of the things that sets coaching apart from mentoring. In a mentoring relationship, you have a more experienced person sharing their knowledge with a less experienced person. In a good mentoring relationship, knowledge is being shared back and forth, and you're both learning and growing. But the foundation, like the definitional part of that relationship is a more experienced person with a less experienced person. Coaching brings that to a more equal level, which is great with a professional coach, not so easy for a managerial coach. You're ultimately responsible for making sure that your team meets certain outcomes. And some employees are going to be more comfortable with being told what to do than with making decisions on their own. Some employees are carrying trauma from past toxic leaders that makes it feel unsafe to engage with you in that way. But within those constraints, when can you actively listen to your employee as an expert in their specialized area? Your ILL specialist is probably going to know more about the details of the back end of your ILL request software than you probably have needed to think about in a long time. Your circulation desk staff are the experts in what actually happens at the desk after hours when you're not around. The thought-provoking and creative process is really about asking a whole lot of questions that are intentionally worded to provoke deeper thought on a topic. And there's a framework to follow to move through getting a better understanding of the challenge, working through the challenge, and establishing some clear next steps. So it's not just aimlessly asking any and all questions that come to mind. So, for example, think about a time when an employee came to you for advice on how to plan a program or choose a topic for a book display or any other project that doesn't have just one correct procedure. Instead of immediately suggesting the way you would do it, what if you started by asking what ideas they've already thought of? And then just ask more questions to workshop one of those ideas. So this process inspires your team member to maximize their personal and professional potential by showing that you believe they already thought through this and they have some great ideas to bring to the table. That communicates that you trust their competence as a professional. And that builds their confidence in their own abilities and their trust that you'll support their choices instead of jumping in to micromanage the process the minute they do something in a way that's different from how you would do it. And that makes it feel safer to take more ownership of that work. So you're supporting them by helping them work through the challenge instead of just telling them to go figure it out on their own. And instead of taking over to instruct them in doing it your way. So this is a lot to put on one conversation. Realistically, it takes time to build the trust to have all of these messages come through. This process is specifically designed to empower those being coached, but that doesn't happen overnight, especially if you have been working with them for 5 years and have some patterns already established that you have to kind of shift. So if this is reminding you of conversations with any of your past or current supervisors, please put a +1 in the chat box. And if you're comfortable, how did it make you feel to work with a supervisor like that? Either y'all are being shy or nobody's had a supervisor like this. All right, moving along. I aspire to be this supervisor. Yes, that's awesome. So the ICF maintains a set of core competencies for professional coaches. Oh, we got scary at first, but fulfilling over time. Thank you for sharing that because it is scary to have a boss just start asking you questions instead of giving you clear instructions. but fulfilling over time because it builds that trust. I'm assuming that's what I'm reading into that. And confidence, yes. Yeah. So the ICF has a set of core competencies for professional coaches. Research on coach training for managers has found that several of these competencies feel less relevant for managerial coaches who have to balance all of the other parts of leadership with coaching their team members. So I'll go over all of them briefly, but focus more on the competencies that are most relevant for managerial coaches who, again, are focusing on incorporating a coaching approach with team members in that more complex environment. So you're usually enmeshed in a web of relationships and histories with people who may or may not really want to be coached. Whereas for professional coaches, like when I work with a client, it's somebody who chose to sign up for coaching and who I don't have any other relationship with. I don't have to write their annual evaluations. In some ways, that relationship is a lot simpler. So the first competency is demonstrates ethical practice, understands and consistently applies coaching ethics and standards of coaching. I'm going to assume that you're committed to ethical practice as a leader. So the only thing I'll mention here is that this includes maintaining confidentiality with client information per stakeholder agreements and pertinent laws. So a coaching conversation is generally held confidential, but is not legally privileged unless otherwise specified. So if a manager hires me to work with one of their reports and wants to get updates, then the three of us need to explicitly agree to the details of what I will and won't report before we get started. As a manager, you should treat the contents of coaching conversations with the same level of discretion as you do personnel issues and only disclose on a need-to-know basis within the proper channels. And I'd encourage you to be upfront about what will be documented and shared before opening a conversation about a sensitive topic. The coaching mindset is the foundation for effective coaching. So I'm going to do a deeper dive into each of the components of this one. So the ICF defines a coaching mindset as engages in ongoing personal and professional learning and development as a coach, works with coaching supervisors or mentor coaches as needed, develops and maintains a mindset that is open, curious, flexible, and client-centered. And that's my emphasis on the last line there, since that's the part that's most relevant for leaders. Receiving coaching, whether that's from a supervisor who's trained in these skills or from an external coach, is incredibly valuable for helping you build this approach into your regular practice. But if you only remember one thing about this mindset, it's about fully engaging your curiosity. So the ICF outlines 10 subcomponents of that competency. When I work with library leaders on building a coaching approach, I tend to focus really heavy on the coaching mindset because it sets the foundation for practicing the other skills, like asking effective coaching questions. But I read several of them as being very closely aligned with a critical perspective. So you may already be doing some of these things. So the first one is acknowledges that clients are responsible for their own choices. And anywhere that they say clients, we're going to just like translate that to employees. This one is really hard for a lot of library leaders because you want everybody on your team to succeed and thrive, and sometimes wind up getting a little bit emotionally invested in trying to force someone to want that for themselves. But if we're going to really emphasize empowering people and respecting their autonomy, that means being very clear, here's what the expectations are, here's what support is available, and here's what the consequences are if you don't do that. And then respect their choices and go to consequences when needed. Um, that's really hard, but that's when it is a choice, we have to respect their choice. Engages in ongoing learning and development as a coach, including remaining aware, blah, blah, blah. Engaging in ongoing learning and development as a library leader is also really important, and building opportunities to engage more curiosity is really valuable. Develops an ongoing reflective practice to enhance one's coaching and to enhance one's leadership. Remains aware of and open to the influence of biases, context, and culture on self and others. This is one that connects really closely for me with the critical approach, and uses awareness of self and one's intuition to benefit clients. This one gets sticky because we have to be aware of all of the structural oppressions and the way that implicit biases function so that we can trust intuition and not let implicit biases masquerade as intuition. Develops and maintains the ability to manage one's emotions. So this is about avoiding emotional spillover when, you have a horrible day. How are you going to cleanse yourself or reschedule a meeting if needed? Maintains emotional, physical, and mental well-being in preparation for, throughout, and following each session. Seeks help from outside sources when necessary. So we can't be everything to everyone. And for leaders, I would add also shifts management styles when needed. Coaching is an amazing approach for a lot of situations, but there are going to be people that just do not feel safe being coached yet. And you might have to shift into other managerial styles. Nurtures openness and curiosity in oneself, the client, and the coaching process, and remains aware of the influence of one's thoughts and behaviors on the client and others. All right, the next one is establishes and maintains agreements, partners with the client and relevant stakeholders to create clear agreements about the coaching relationship, process, plans, and goals, establishes agreements for the overall coaching engagement as well as those for each coaching session. My experience has been that this one feels less connected for the managers I work with until we dig into that last line. One of the fears the leaders I work with have about asking a lot of questions is that they may open a can of worms that leads them to spending 2 hours listening to someone vent without ever getting to any productive resolution. A key part of the coaching conversation is identifying what exactly we're going to accomplish in that conversation. So we start by exploring the problem, just like in a reference interaction. The problem someone brings to you is often not what they really need. The difference is in what comes next. Instead of just giving them a solution in a coaching conversation, you help them work through developing their own solution that builds on their own strengths and incorporates the support they need to succeed. So once we dig below the surface to figure out what the real challenge is, then we agree on what we can actually accomplish in this conversation and then work toward that goal. That focus on what we can accomplish in this conversation keeps us grounded in the here and now instead of spending 2 hours venting about all sorts of factors that are beyond our control. Sometimes that goal is to make a decision about how to proceed on a project. Sometimes it's to work out what the next steps need to be. So, like, do I do this or do that? Or do we need to map out each next step? Sometimes it's to figure out where they can get the support they need. Cultivates trust and safety. Partners with the client to create a safe, supportive environment that allows the client to share freely, maintains a relationship of mutual respect and trust. So this includes some more critically aligned components like seeking to understand the client within their context, which may include their identity, environment, experiences, values, and beliefs, demonstrating respect for the client's identity, perception, style, and language, and adapting one's coaching to the client, and acknowledging and respecting the client's unique talents, insights, and work in the coaching process. Maintains presence, is fully conscious and present with the client, employing a style that's open, flexible, grounded, and confident. So if your mind is somewhere else during the conversation, like mentally preparing for your meeting with your boss that's scheduled right after this meeting with your team member, then it's going to be really hard to actively listen to them, which means you probably won't be that effective in coaching them. Listens actively is the next core competency. So this is focusing on what the client is and is not saying to fully understand what's being communicated in the context of the client systems and to support client self-expression. At work, we don't tend to get to focus as much on employee self-expression, but active listening is still really important for helping your team members work through challenges so that they build confidence and can take more ownership in their work. So, how often do you practice just actively listening to someone without getting distracted by the response you want to make as soon as they stop talking? Put a +1 in the chat if you feel a little bit called out right now. Yeah, that one's really common because we're encouraged to have a response right away. And this one's especially hard to work on with ADHD because we want to just jump in and respond right away, which can lead to cutting people off and shifting that focus from a back and forth conversation to I'm trying to stay focused to understand the whole context kind of shifts the focus of the conversation. And it's really hard, whether you have ADHD or not, to make that shift. But it's so important. And in coaching, active listening means using all of your senses, listening to the words that are being said, what's not being said, how they're being said, as well as paying attention to the body language of the person. So if they're discussing ideas for a project, do they suddenly light up when they mention one possible way to go? Or do they shift their tone of voice in a way that feels like a 2-ton weight just got dropped on their shoulders? So it's important to note here that this means focusing on what's normal for that person, not how well they conform to body language norms at a cultural level. For example, neurodivergent folks might have body language that doesn't always fit neurotypical norms. So if they get comfortable enough to let down their guard around you, it's important to pay attention to their baseline and watch for changes from that. And coaches stay attentive to these shifts, but also stay curious instead of jumping to assumptions. So, using the example of someone who sounds like a huge weight just dropped on their shoulders, instead of saying, it sounds like you don't like that idea, a coach might respond more like, I noticed that your tone of voice shifted when you said that. What did that bring up for you? So, the next competency is evokes awareness. Facilitates client insight and learning by using tools and techniques such as powerful questioning, silence, metaphor, or analogy. When I talk with library leaders about coaching skills, I tend to focus on the powerful questions part of this, though practicing silence to hold space for someone to process a new perspective is also really important here. Learning to ask effective coaching questions is one of the more visible parts of adopting a coaching approach. And it sounds so simple, but it can be really hard to do because it's so different from how most of us have been socialized to interact and how we often think about what it means to be helpful. So, how you phrase your questions is going to shape the way people will respond. Good coaching questions are open ended, like a good research question, authentically curious. So, we're not leading somebody to our answer. We're not trying to get them to buy into what we want them to do. We're actually authentically curious. They're succinct, they're transparent. So you don't have a hidden agenda. You're not leading them anywhere. They're non judgmental. They're very intentionally worded and they're grounding. So they keep the conversation in the here and now instead of going off into what if catastrophe land. So that's a lot of qualities to keep in mind, and it takes time to build a habit of asking these sorts of questions. The key is to remember that we're helping them work through the problem solving process instead of just handing them our solutions. And then the last competency is facilitates client growth. Partners with the client to transform learning and insight into action. Promotes client autonomy in the coaching process. Some of the key components outlined in this competency include works with the client to integrate new awareness, insight, or learning into their worldview and behaviors. So we're not just analyzing a problem to analyze it. We're looking for, okay, how's that going to help you move forward? How are you going to integrate this thing that you learned here into what you actually do on a day-to-day basis? And then partners with the client to design goals, actions, and accountability measures that integrate and expand new learning. And this is clearly connected to leading a team and making sure that we've got clear expectations, working out what the plan's going to be and how they're going to check in or, what their deadlines are going to be or what's going to keep them on track. And then invites the client to consider how to move forward, including resources, support, and potential barriers. And this is another really important part of setting those goals and action items is, okay, so what support do you need to actually succeed in this? A lot of managers want to ask, what support do you need from me? And I always caution people to just cut it off at what support do you need? Because one, most of us don't have time to do extra stuff unless that's what's really needed. And when you say, what do you need from me? You're limiting the range of possibilities. Maybe they realize the support they need is actually to go talk to this other person or a training program or something like that. Okay, so that all sounds great, but what does this look like in practice? In a previous webinar, I had folks submit questions and several of them had questions dealing with challenges related to motivating team members. And that seems like a common struggle. So hopefully these examples will resonate with you as well. So one person mentioned part-time staff who don't see this job as part of their career. They complete tasks just to say it's finished, but don't actually take the time to do a good job and never take any extra initiative. In another instance, the person described a longtime union employee who plans to stay in their current role until they retire. And they were struggling with how to motivate this person to do more than just coast along doing what they've been doing. In both of those cases, my initial reaction is to ask, why they should be motivated. Why should the part-time employees take extra initiative? I understand why we might want them to do that, but what's in it for them? As a coaching leader, I would want to know what their goals are and then work with them to look for ways they can use their current role to achieve those goals. What that looks like depends on a lot of factors. So if someone spends their whole shift staffing the circ desk, then there's less room to be creative than in some other roles. And your existing relationships with them affects how you jump into this. With people who are working a part-time job just for the paycheck while they're in a degree program or actively looking for a job in their chosen career path, you can start by asking what their career goals are. And then ask questions about what that sort of job would entail. And ask what attracts them to that sort of work. And then look for any opportunities to connect their work to those goals, whether that's translating their current tasks or giving them an opportunity to create a project that's more aligned with their goals. The key here is to ask questions and listen instead of jumping into your own brainstorming. I've seen a lot of managers who tried to make this connection by suggesting projects. Oh, you're working on an MBA in marketing. Why don't you help manage our social media? We assume that would appeal to them because it's marketing, but we don't actually know. Maybe that'll sound exciting, or maybe that sounds like you're just trying to get specialist level work for non-specialist pay. So instead, oh, you're working on an MBA in marketing. What kind of marketing are you most interested in? What kind of projects do you see yourself working on? And of course, listening to their response in between these, not just rapid fire questions. And then what is it about that work that excites you? And then I'd love to find a way to bring some of that, whatever it is that excites them, into your time here. What ideas come to mind for you? And I know that can sound like opening a big, scary can of worms. So maybe the next response is that sounds amazing, but I don't know how I can make an argument for that big of a project. We'd probably need to scale that down to something that would only take up an hour or two per week, or that could get done within this time frame, or whatever constraints you're working within. How could we make that work? So the key here is that you're asking some pretty short questions that help the employee connect the dots between the work they want to do for a career and what they're doing in your library, and mostly listening to their thoughts and ideas. Again, this assumes that you can give them some autonomy to shape some part of their work, even if that's just 1 out of 20 hours each week. So we started with some pretty open assumptions, and then we worked toward a more concrete plan. Maybe you wind up ending the conversation with a proposal that you'll take to your director or dean. Maybe they come up with something that you can greenlight on the spot, and so you just map out the next steps in a timeline. For the longtime employee, what actually matters most to them about the rest of their time here? Now, I'm not trying to say that one coaching session is going to magically fix everything. It takes time for people to get used to this new approach. And some people are going to respond with the shortest answers possible to every question. Sometimes you'll have to shift gears to another leadership style. But taking the time to ask questions and actively listen can help you learn what motivates each team member, learn what's getting in the way for each team member, find out where there are miscommunications around expectations. And for those who are more open to engaging with your coaching, whether you call it that or just using a more curious leadership approach, this helps you help them connect the dots between the day-to-day work with the reasons that work matters, and help them develop in ways that matter to them. So how do you put this into action in your own work? One of the small changes that people I've worked with have had success with was to restructure their regular one-to-one meetings with their reports to start with just asking an open-ended question about how their work's going, and then intentionally just asking more genuinely curious, interested, non-judgmental questions about it for the first 10 minutes. They're not necessarily having a full coaching conversation, but even that small shift helps them build trust and more effectively support their team members. All right. This has been a lot. I immediately forget everything I do when asked that question. When asked,
The question about how's your work going? I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I don't remember anything that I do.
so instead of how's your work going, what challenge are you dealing with this week? Or what are you most, what are you working on this week that you're most excited about? Or something open like that, that feels a little bit less being put on the spot to report, um, but can also open a conversation. How does that land for you?
Yeah, I think I just do better with more specifics. Like if it's too open-ended, then it's yeah, too much for me to think about on the spot, I guess.
Yeah, and that narrowing that focus definitely helps to, what are you working on this week that you're most excited about? Or, and then you can also, over time, build this as more of a practice so that people are coming in expecting it. The first time you try it, you might send out an email the week before and say, hey, I'm going to try something new. And I want to hear what challenge you need help working through. So people come in prepared thinking, okay, we're going to talk about something that I need some help working through. And then when you ask the question, they go to what they prepared. So there are a lot of ways to make this shift, and something a little more structured is easier than just what's on your mind today. All right. And this has been a lot. So I've got a few links for where you can learn some more. So you can read through the full ICF core competencies document on their website. You can also learn more about their coach training programs and credentialing requirements. For full disclosure, I also offer training programs in managerial coaching that are not accredited by the ICF because I focus on the skills most relevant for leading a team instead of preparing anyone to become a professional coach. I'm happy to talk more with anyone who's interested, but I'm not here to do a sales pitch on that. I also write a free newsletter, the Coaching Librarian newsletter, focusing on applying a coaching approach to your work as a library leader. I don't always explicitly focus on connecting coaching with critical librarianship, but that critical lens affects the way that I approach all of my work. You can check out past issues and sign up if you'd like at leadwithcuriosity.org/newsletter. And then I've also recently started hosting free monthly facilitated discussions about some aspect of applying a coaching approach to your leadership practice. The next meeting is June 2nd and focuses on leading from your values. Now, these are open discussions, not presentations, and they're not recorded. You can get all of the details and register at leadwithcuriosity.org/curious-leaders. And before we shift over to ask for any questions, I have a question for you. How are you going to take at least one baby step this week toward actually putting some of this into practice? If you're comfortable, please respond in the chat. I think I'll start with that focused question you mentioned. Like, what are you excited about, challenged by this week? That's awesome. I really love the question about what challenge do you need the most support with? I'd be comfortable asking my managers this, and it'll focus our meetings a bit more. Practice active listening. Yes. If you're still typing a response, I look forward to reading it. But also, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in. I think I'll start challenging the idea that I admit I have that there are natural leaders, and that is something that can be learned and worked on. Yes, that that's a narrative that's so common, but it really is. Some of us are encouraged from the time we are itty bitty to practice leadership skills, and others of us are discouraged from those behaviors. And the more you practice, the easier it becomes, and it just takes time and skill building. This has been really interesting as I've tended to have more peer conversations with managers rather than being managed. So thinking about some of the questions might help me with my discussions with my manager. That's awesome. I talk a lot about coaching as a leadership style because recognizing the power dynamic that when you are the manager, you have more influence over the culture of your unit than any individual member of the unit. And coaching the other way, coaching up, can be risky because if you start asking questions to one of those leaders that takes questions as if you were challenging their authority, that's a big risk. Um, but when you have a good relationship, that's another really valuable way to position yourself as someone who's thoughtful with a lot of leadership potential. And it's also a great way to support your peers to practice using these coaching questions with one another. A question, what are your thoughts on peer/mutual mentorship? I could see how this would complement coaching. So mentoring is fundamentally sharing ex a more experienced person sharing experience with a less experienced person. When it's peers, maybe that's closer to even. That's an incredibly valuable form of support. Coaching can help with sort of integrating what advice did you get there that actually is useful for you? What do you want to take? What do you not want to take with you? Mentoring tends to involve a lot of suggestions and advice that sometimes is a great idea, sometimes just doesn't really land. So coaching can help you work through what what you want to take and what you want to leave. And then sometimes coaching is like, okay, so what resources are you going to draw on? And that's where mentoring, finding somebody who can share some more ideas, share their expertise, complements the coaching. So yeah, it goes back and forth. And I'm seeing some more responses coming in. I'm also a fan of Brene Brown's work, and she said that it's wild that folks like athletes are expected to have coaches, but managers, the people who are responsible for people on a daily basis, often don't have coaches themselves. So I'm a fan of managers getting coaches. Yes. When I try this with my employee, she doesn't give much in response. For example, what are you particularly enjoying working on? What are you interested in doing next? Even though she knows I'll try to give her opportunities, she wants if I can. So that is, and I'm interested in what Angela mentioned about employees without motivation. Some people are okay with just doing their job and going home and don't want more. So what to do then? Is that so bad? Um, so thinking about this in sort of the critical lens of we're here to give people autonomy and respect what's important to them. And also going back to that coaching mindset of employees are responsible for their choices. Some people are not going to want to engage in coaching. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It can be really scary at first, or they just don't have they just are here for the paycheck or whatever. If our goal is to provide the support that they need to succeed in their jobs, sometimes that means, okay, they're not ready to be coached right now. So I'm going to shift to another leadership style. If they're not motivated to do more than expectations, then just being very clear, here's what the expectations are to meet what I need from you. And that's good enough. Sometimes we have to respect that this is just a job for people. This is incredibly valuable for people who want to engage, but there are a lot of like trauma issues from past toxic leaders. I mean, I've had one of those myself that, like, if you admit to any struggle, that's just going to be used against you. And that makes it really hard to be open with a future leader. Um, and that, so it's not bad at all, but then you might perhaps might get a situation of some resentment among the team of, I do more than that person and we get paid the same. And that's a whole other ball of worms that comes with managing a team and coaching a team instead of just coaching individuals and balancing that. Here's what the expectations are. What is motivating you to go beyond that? And if people are going beyond that because they feel obligated, then that sets up resentment. If people are going beyond that because this work is actually personally meaningful to them and that's what they are making the choice to do, then what are they getting out of it beyond the paycheck? How is the level of the work they're doing connecting with other other rewards? And also what can be done to acknowledge those that are going above and beyond? I hope that was a useful response and not just too rambly.
No, not at all. And perfectly answered in the amount of time we had left as well. So
Awesome.
fantastic. I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking Angela, both in the chat or by responding. Thank you so much, Angela. That is the end of day 2 of Calc. That means we're on to day 3, final day tomorrow, where we will start at 1 o'clock British summer time. Your time zone may vary, as I say. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your day. And thank you again, Angela.
Thank you all for being here.